Welcome to episode 5 of Saying Something Sober, the podcast where I decide the topic and it could be literally anything. Today's topic, the Traitors UK Season 2. So I'm recording this on Sunday. I recorded the previous episode yesterday, but I wanted to record this episode pretty quickly because as I'm recording this on Sunday the 28th of January 2024, the final was on Friday. So I want it all to be very fresh because a lot obviously happened. It was a great season. I mean, what excellent TV, right? Like, what excellent reality television. And I've talked about in the past how I have a niche interest in kind of social strategy, reality competition shows. I think American Survivor is obviously been going on 45 seasons, so that's kind of the staple, but also things like The Circle, the UK one that was on for 3 seasons, The Mole that was on Netflix for a bit. Anything where there's a lot of like lying and deceit or kind of allyship and things like that. I think it's really interesting because these players are put in situations where they're doing stuff they would never do in their everyday life, right? They're not going around backstabbing people and lying to their face, and you can tell because some of the players just feel so badly about it. But one thing I will say is that I refuse to portray what happens on the show as somebody's real character. This is a pressurized environment. It's a TV show. It's a game. These players are doing what the game is asking of them. And the way that they are responding in no way speaks to the way that they live their personal life or who they are as a person. There are obviously players who really get into it and really love the kind of lying and the backstabbing. And potentially that says that, they enjoy this kind of game, but it does not mean that they are a lying, backstabbing person in their personal life, because morality comes into play in real life, whereas morality doesn't quite come into play in this game because ultimately you're not killing people. You're not directly causing them harm. It's just part of the game and you kind of have to do it to be able to win the money. There are kind of levels to it, obviously. Some people kind of revel in it a lot more openly than others, but that doesn't mean anything, I don't think. Anyway, I will start off this episode by saying a couple episodes ago I spoke about how the tide was out and I'd had not a rough couple of days, but I'd just been feeling down or demotivated. The tide was out, I was off the horse kind of thing. But little update on that, I am feeling a lot better. I'm back on the horse, if you will. The tide has come in and I'm feeling a lot more positive. I had a good weekend where I've been very productive, very positive, done a lot of things that I enjoy, done things on my own terms, and done a lot of life admin. I had a Friday off and I managed to just kind of get on top of everything that I wanted to get on top of, things that were on my to-do list that were just kind of piling up, and those things can just kind of add to your stress. And so I just thought I'm just gonna focus today on getting that stuff out of the way, getting it done, because it's just not fun to have it looming. Anyway, with that said, I will get on with the show. So I loved Traitors Season 1, especially the UK version. It was just such drama, such good television. I mean, the ending, the finale episode was really like that climax. And it actually aired before Christmas because I remember I was on the way to my grandma's for Christmas and I was watching it in a hotel, and it felt like this kind of untapped thing. It was big-ish, it was kind of blowing up, but It wasn't huge. And I hate to play like I knew it before it was cool, but I'd actually watched the Australian season months before when it had aired, and I thought it was alright. The Australian season wasn't as good, and I kind of skipped through a lot of it, but then it kind of appeared on BBC iPlayer that the UK one was there, and I was like, oh. So I started watching it. Then I convinced my parents to watch it. And then after the UK one, I watched the American one. And obviously, they have a lot of celebrities on that one. And I knew quite a few of the celebrities because they are famous for being on other reality competition shows. So, spoiler alert, by the way, for all Traitors related stuff. So, stop listening now if you've not watched it and are intending to watch it. But the winner of the American season, I knew her from Survivor, and she has played multiple seasons of Survivor and never actually won it. But I knew her from that, and she played a really good game on the American one. I think there are so many good seasons out there. Even Australia 2, which has just been put on BBC iPlayer, I really liked that one. Much more than I liked Australian season 1. I think out there the consensus is that season 1 Australia is better than season 2, but I actually felt the opposite. I really liked the ending of Australian season 2, mainly because there was this villain the whole season who was just like this, who was just such an annoying traitor, and he kind of got his comeuppance at the end. But Traitors season 1 UK, yeah, so super good. Amanda is queen. But with Traitors season 2, they obviously knew that it was this super popular show, and so this time around, the challenges were a lot better. It felt like it had found its groove with a lot of things. Like the challenges, I think season 1, there were a couple that felt a bit odd. Like in season 1, there was the one where they had to do the laser maze thing, get through the lasers, and that was a weird challenge. But this season, challenges were a lot better. The twists were a lot better. They knew kind of what to do to like generate the drama. The players were actually really good. I think when casting shows like this, the thing that really clinches it is whether you get a good cast, whether you get a good diverse cast as well. You don't want everyone to be like the best at the game, because then it's going to be not very satisfying. It's good to see players fall for the lies a little bit, whereas if they were kind of too on it, they wouldn't fall for them and you wouldn't be as satisfied. I think this season there were just so many good plays, but also so many awful plays as well. I mean, I'm going to start with my top line thoughts, and then I'll kind of go through the players in order of kind of elimination and give what I think about their situation, how they played, and then I'm going to give my overall season feelings with a little bit of a summary of kind of what happened. So I've got 3 top line thoughts noted down. The first one is Diane. That's all I need to say. But Ross is that's it. That's all that needs to be said. The second point is Paul versus Miles, which, in my opinion, was the peak of this season. I think last season the peak was kind of the final 2 episodes, but the peak for this season was most definitely about midway through, probably episodes 7 and 8, I think. And then the last top line thought that I have noted down is Harry and Molly. And that is all I'm going to say on those 3 points. On to the players. So we're starting with Aubrey, who was a faithful and was murdered the first night. And I think the first murder and even the first banishment are really tough because it's kind of picked on very little, but you give the traitors anything, or if you give the players anything to go off, they will go off of it. So you have to be really careful. Obviously, the episode prior to this, they recruited Miles, and so there were 4 traitors this season to start with, which kind of threw a lot of the faithfuls for a loop the whole season. They were constantly trying to figure out how many traitors there were. I think the best bet is just to work from there's as many as there probably can be. Maybe there's something in the rule book about how many there can be max. So I would always work from the assumption that there's 4 or however many is the maximum. But Aubrey obviously was murdered first, and I think this was probably a very, very smart murder. I think one thing this whole season the traitors were really good at was picking the right people to murder. There are a couple questionable ones, I think, but Aubrey, I think his demeanor and the way he was speaking to players like, "Oh, I've got a couple theories, but I'm not going to share them. And I'm really smart. I'm very like assessing," and he wasn't letting on too much. I think that's suspicious. That's unnerving. And if you're a traitor and you hear that, it's like, okay, well, I'm just going to get rid of you now because I don't know what you've got, but I'd rather not find out. So, and then we had Sonia, who is a similar case to Aubrey, where just went in all guns blazing, kind of not really thinking about how when it comes down to it, if you give anything for the players to vote you off to banish you, then they will. So Sonia was a faithful, obviously, and she was the first banishment. I think last season the first banishment was just embarrassing, but this season they actually, I think, made the best choice that they could. You're never going to get a traitor out the first go. If we're being honest, like statistically, no traitor is going to behave in a way that leads them to get banished out first. I mean, maybe it will happen in the future, but Sonia was literally in confessionals saying, "Oh, I'm gonna stir the pot, but I'm not gonna tell my faithfuls that." And then she started stirring the pot, bringing up stuff that someone said to someone, to other people in front of them to get people put on the spot, but not at the round table. So instantly, people are looking at her like, "Well, you're just here to cause drama." So even if you aren't a traitor, you're a faithful that I don't want to stick around because you're going to make my job harder in finding a traitor. So it's kind of like a win-win for the other faithfuls to vote her out. So I think that was her mistake was kind of going in like that. But I think she wanted to be a traitor really, really badly. And I've thought about the potential of like them doing an All-Stars season at some point, but it would be difficult because people would already have kind of assumptions about you, especially if any of the players got very far. But maybe they could do like an all-star season of players that didn't get a chance to play it too much. And so that way there wouldn't be too much to go off and stuff like that. But, if Sonia went into an all-star season, people are going to have seen how she behaved. And then let's say she does get pictured as traitor. They would probably vote her out pretty quickly because she's suspicious and she would make a good traitor. So I don't know. Then we've got Kyra. I think this, to be honest, for me, I really didn't see them murdering Kyra because I hadn't really thought about it. But she was really vocal in that first round table. And so she was obviously threatening. She could rally people really, really well. And I think, to be honest, had she stayed in, I think she would have done really well. So it was probably one of their smartest murders was her because she was very, very vocal, kind of like a very leader-esque kind of vibe. So unfortunate that she only got one round table to kind of make herself known, but the shields are in play, and I think she probably could have made a case to get one, but there was that whole tension around shields and Zach, and this is the thing about a lot of the faithfuls is they pick up on the wrong things. They pick up on things that just don't matter. They say all the time, "Oh, they're a really good team player in challenges, so I don't think they're a traitor." You're all looking to win the money, so the traitors are going to do well in challenges too. And this whole shield thing, it's like, why does she want a shield? Does she just want to take it off the faithfuls? She wants a shield so she can sleep at night. Like, yeah, she got one last week, but that's not going to protect her this week. So I think the faithfuls love to pick up on things like that, but then the traitors will work with that. Zach had all these crazy theories he was checking out, and the shield one was just perfect for the traitors to just kind of manipulate. Then we move on to Brian. Obviously, all of these people are faithfuls, but this was the first episode we saw the faithfuls get close with Ash. So there was a tie vote this episode between Ash, Diane, and Brian. And Brian's name had not come up at all. And he just floundered. He drowned. He went into that challenge and got told he was a sheep and just couldn't handle it. So he just suddenly was suspect number one. He was up there with Ash as receiving the most votes. Luckily for us, Diane was safe for another couple of episodes. But he obviously went home over Ash by quite a few votes. But we saw Paul and Harry both vote Ash. Paul gave Harry the wink, the nod, the kind of signal to vote Ash out. And she didn't go that episode, and she was annoyed. But Brian he couldn't speak in the round table. He was saying things like, "Oh, I can't speak now, but if you keep me in, I'll explain after." And if you were a faithful hearing that, you'd be like, that's a trick to try and keep yourself in here, mate. You're going now. So he obviously went. He didn't get to do much. I knew who he was because of his Scottish accent, but prior to that, I wouldn't have been able to put a name to a face. And so he kind of didn't have much time to shine, but I think the game just got too much for him, to be honest. And as much as I kind of imagine myself in it, I'm like, oh yeah, I would do so well. I do think that if you're sat at a table with 15 other people pointing at you saying you're a traitor, you'd get very emotional, or just you'd feel the panic set in, because I think there's probably something like biological about it from when we were animals, of being kicked out of the group and being banished. It's like, well, how am I going to survive on my own? Who knows? Maybe that's too deep. Anyway, we then move on to our first traitor catch. So the faithfuls get Ash next episode, which I think makes the most sense. She was up against Brian in that episode. Brian turned out to be a faithful, so logically you would go for Ash next. And I think last season, season 1, and even a bit sometimes in this season, they sometimes fail to do this. Someone gets put on the questioning block and they're typically up against another person. And then that other person goes and they're a faithful. And the faithfuls next episode don't then make the logical next step of getting the person out who was next to them, who is in second place. Because a lot of the time, that person who's in second place is actually a traitor. But this time, they did do that. So Ash was the first traitor to go. I think it was right for Paul and Harry to throw to the wolves in this episode. I think Paul is very cutthroat and he got cocky very, very quickly. And I think he threw her under the bus too fast. He was so quick about it. In the episode Brian went, he was like, "Yep, we're voting her." But Brian went, and I think they should have voted for Brian and he would have gone, and then it would have not caused tension with Ash. But they both voted Ash and she didn't go. So it's just, too fast, too eager to get rid of another traitor. But I think they are learning from the previous season. And this is something I've seen in Survivor and a lot of other reality shows where a precedent is set in a season. Something happens and the precedent is set so that the next season, the players have all seen the TV show. And so they know that X thing can happen, or that this thing is the way to play it. Like, they changed the way that shields work this season because the mechanic last season was cracked by someone, where they said, nobody tell anyone if you get the shield when you go into the shield room, the armory. And that kind of broke the mechanic. And so players all learned that that's something they can do. So the producers had to change the shield mechanic this season. And I think it worked a lot better the way shields were this season. They were a lot rarer. They didn't always get one, which was better. I think there was a lot more uncertainty. But Ash goes, and I think she wasn't great at being a traitor, to be honest. I think she was very, very shifty just naturally. I think even if she was a faithful, she probably would have been banished early because I think just the way that she was unsure of herself in the game made it hard for players to trust her. Obviously, this was around the the dungeon twist, which was a really good twist. I think they did something similar last season where kind of 3 people were marked for death or something. But I think this was a lot better, and the traitors almost made a huge blunder. I think Paul wanted to put himself in there because he was the most popular, and it was this theory he was creating with the Faithfuls where they were going for the most popular players, and I think that was the right idea. But as soon as Ash said, "Oh, I want to go in there so that I can verify myself," he should have pulled out. I think it was a mistake for Ash to go in there because I think it was very obvious that the traitors probably put somebody in there who's a traitor, and Ash is already very, very suspicious. So logical next step is that she's the one that's been put in there. But Paul is also a traitor, and so what they kind of did to themselves was put 2 traitors in there and force themselves to pick between only 2 other players, and then one of them gets saved, so they have to get rid of the person left. And I think Meg obviously gets murdered because she's the only one in the dungeon left, and they put her in there because she had a bit of suspicion on her. But she didn't really work out that she was screwed. She didn't work out that she was either going to get banished next episode if she wasn't murdered, which she had to be because Andrew was saved, or she was going to get murdered because she had to be, and there were possibly 2 traitors in the dungeon. She didn't kind of make that next step, and I guess it's probably harder when you're in the game to see something like that and figure it out. But even when she was murdered, the clip of her opening the letter and reading it is she kind of says something that shows that she doesn't realize that Paul is a traitor. And with all the information she had right there and there, it should have made sense. But that twist was really good, and the traitors almost put themselves in a situation where no one would have been murdered. But I don't know what would have happened then. It would have been absolute chaos, but a very entertaining watch, I'm sure. Had it happened, I think Paul would have been screwed. He would have probably been banished just so that they can be sure. But Harry and Miles would have been fine. And that was the thing that I was recognizing at the time, was that Harry, less so Miles, Harry was very, very smartly sowing seeds that he was a faithful by saying little things that kind of you wouldn't expect a traitor to say. Something like, "Oh, I told you so," or something like that. Little things to moments to people. And he was also saying names, being very vocal, making connections, and not implicating himself in situations like this. He didn't have anything to do with the dungeon based on what the faithful saw. He had no connection to the dungeon. And again, later when the Poisoned Chalice, he had no connection to the Poisoned Chalice. No one could link it back to him. So he was being very smart. Miles also wasn't linked to the dungeon. But the thing with Miles that I was recognizing at this point in the game was that anytime somebody asked him what his opinion was, he would just say, "I'm back to ground zero. I'm back to square one." But you're kind of thinking, you were never at any other square, so what are you talking about? And I knew that it would kind of come back to haunt him, and it did a bit. When the Poisoned Chalice happened, he obviously was put on the block, and someone said, "You never seem to have an opinion about anyone." And that's the thing, as a traitor, just because you're getting through the early stages of the game doesn't mean you're going to get to the finale, because in the early stages of the game, you need to set yourself up in a way that people are going to keep you at that final 4 situation. Because if you have any suspicion, no one's going to keep you in. And I don't think Miles, and to be honest, I don't even think Paul, depending on who was murdered and who went out if they didn't, I don't think that they would have made it into that final four unless there was enough traitors. But who knows? Hypotheticals. So Meg obviously goes, and then they banish Johnny. This was kind of a shocking banish for me. I didn't realize that people were so suspicious of him, and that episode kind of they were starting to talk about him, and it makes sense. He was very leader vibes, and I think people kind of take that as, oh, he's trying to sway the group, so he's probably a traitor. And he had no way to defend himself because it wasn't concrete evidence against him. And obviously Harry voted for him and kind of put on a show, but I also don't think it was a show. I think Harry genuinely felt guilty, which is something to be said about the way that Harry handled being a traitor versus the way that Paul did. I think he felt very authentic, whereas Paul's emotion always felt like a theatre show. And he did kind of admit that in the confessionals. So Johnny goes, and he's obviously a faithful, and then they murder Tracy. Now, this murder, I think, was a really smart one, but I thought she should have been murdered earlier. To be honest, I would have put in the dungeon, I probably would have put her, and I wouldn't have had two traitors. So I'd have Paul or Ash. Sure, Andrew can go in there. And then I would have had Diane and probably Tracy. And that would have been the group. I don't think Meg makes any sense. I think she already has suspicion on her and was probably going to get banished. But to put her in there kind of forced them to murder her, which was a bit of a waste of a murder. I think they should have put someone in there who, no matter what, if they were forced to murder them, it would have been good. So Tracy was murdered. Sad to see her go. She was quite a character. She kind of gave me Maddie vibes a bit, but a bit more screwed on. And then Anthony is banished. And Anthony had suspicion on him kind of from day one, mainly for a rubbish piece of evidence. It's not even evidence, and that Diane put forward, which was that he was rude to her when they were lining up. But, like, no one had been selected as a traitor then. And then people were saying that he was different on the train than he was in the game, but it's like, you don't know him. And he was probably trying to make a good impression on the train. But the one piece of damning, not evidence, but information, is how defensive he gets. He gets so defensive and snappy as soon as someone puts him on the block. And I know that that's probably how someone would react, and different people react differently. But when you react like that, it makes it hard for people to change their mind. I think a lot of the time, especially this season, people were going into the round table with a name in their head, especially as we got later on. I'd say Anthony's round table was probably the last round table where people were swayed to vote. I think all the future round tables, everyone went in with an idea of who they were going to vote for, and that is who they ended up voting for. I think he made it hard for people to have faith in him, and it's always hard to convince people to not vote you. So to get defensive is instantaneously not going to do anything. And then we move on to the Poisoned Chalice with Diane and the fizzy wine, the dreaded fizzy wine. Obviously, we knew Diane was going to get murdered at some point. I think in the earlier stages of the game, she did well to balance the suspicion, having suspicion on you, but not getting banished, but having enough suspicion on you that the traitors aren't going to murder you. But she reached a point where people had enough faith in her and trust that she was too big of a threat, and so they poisoned her. And I think she was also the easiest to poison because she'd made it vocally known that she was gasping for a drink, which a woman after my own heart, but not an alcoholic drink. Some 0% beer or 0% fizzy wine. No Secco, maybe. But Diane was a good murder. I think it was the most apt murder for the Queen, the mother, Diane. And what a morbid episode. This, I think, was probably the peak of the season, the best episode of the season. I think the one that followed was was also really, really good. So these 2 episodes were probably the best 2. And there was so much that went on that led people later on to get banished or murdered. For example, obviously, Diane says to Paul that she thinks that if she is the poisoned one, that Miles is the traitor. That then leads on for Miles to get banished. But Evie did overhear that. She tweeted that she did hear what Paul and Diana were talking about. But Evie lies in the round table that Paul's heard that. And that leads kind of for Paul to get banished. But there was a lot more with Paul one. So yeah, Diane gets murdered. She her coffin lays there, and they're all mourning her. Ross obviously has to kind of role play his mother's funeral, which is just morbid. And Charlotte almost throws up, which, I mean, I get that it's probably very emotional, but calm down. Then we move into the banishment, and it's Miles versus Paul. And now this honestly was the moment of the season, and in my opinion, the downfall of Paul. He went too hard on this Miles vote. He sowed the seeds in the car, and he should have left it at that. He should have left it at like, oh, Diane said this to me, but I don't know. But he went so hard to get him out that he wanted to verify himself, but because he went so hard for it, it just looked suspicious. And obviously Harry, the smart boy he is, mentions in the round table to, I think, Zach, that he's like, do you think that this is traitor on traitor? And it's such a good moment of like, oh wow, he's not only getting rid of Miles, but he's like thinking the next step ahead and get rid of Paul. Because Paul was going to do a Wilf and betray every traitor that came across. I mean, Harry kind of did that, but in a much nicer way. So Miles goes, he is a traitor. It's their second traitor. It's been a while since they got one. And then they head into the next banishment because that night they recruit Andrew. They head into the next banishment, and Harry just lays into Paul because, from what Harry's heard, Paul is trying to sow the seeds of his name, which is true. And some people kind of say, like, oh, it wasn't that big of a deal. He just mentioned his name. But that's the sowing the seeds. And Harry could tell that. Harry was smart to know that Paul's just doing this week, but next week he's going to go hard for me. So Harry came with the facts, and he brought up everything about Paul that I was so frustrated that players hadn't picked up on. The dungeon. Why hadn't Paul been murdered? It doesn't make any sense. His own theory of the traitors are murdering the biggest players, and everyone's own theory that Meg was probably a traitor, or at least she was just too quiet of a faithful. And then they murder Meg over Paul. Obviously, we know they can't murder Paul, but logically, why would they not murder Paul? How did he survive? It doesn't make any sense. He had no reason, and no one seemed to be talking about that. But Harry brings it up, and then everyone goes, oh yeah, like I was thinking about that. And I was like, oh, thank God. Everyone had considered it, but they just weren't saying it, which is so annoying. Obviously, Jazz had mentioned that he had like traitorous suspicions of Paul, and it all just came to a head. And for a second there, I did think potentially that Jazz was going to go over Paul, but I think he put the nail in his own coffin when Miles went, because he went so hard for him. And then his emotional kind of reaction after Miles goes was first cheering and kind of angry, and then just sobbing. And I think maybe part of it was real, but I think a lot of it was probably him trying to convince people that he was sympathetic, or that, it was. But I think that was the wrong reaction. I don't think that's actually how Paul or really someone would react. I think they'd be vindicated. They'd feel achieved, not cry. We then move on to Charlie getting murdered. This was kind of an odd murder for me. They said that they were murdering her because she'd never get banished, but I hadn't picked up on that vibe. Maybe there was something in the game that would have meant that they thought that. I think, to be honest, Jazz should have been murdered here. I think he went on to the final, obviously, and Harry admits in a confessional that he had underestimated Jazz. Jazz should have been murdered probably at every single point from now that they had to murder. There was only one more murder after Charlie, and it was Zach. So I would have murdered Jazz here and then Zach. And it just doesn't make sense why they kept him around. Charlie is murdered, and it implicates Charlotte. So it did do something good. I think potentially you could have run with the idea that Charlotte was a traitor anyway because of Paul and them being so close. Charlotte goes. Harry writes on his chalkboard, Charlotte spelled Charlot, and the memes of that have just been like stellar. I think the memes this season are just so good. They're so funny, and I think the show being so popular is what leads there to be so many memes. Charlotte made sense as a banish, and it was a good play. For the whole season, I'd been kind of annoyed at her because she just wasn't. She was being stupid, I think, and she was falling for Paul's like theatre show, and then she kind of turned on him at the last minute, and I thought, oh my gosh, finally you're not as stupid as I thought. And it kind of was the nail in her coffin because people thought she was a traitor just turning on another traitor. But that is the episode that Harry does probably the best play of the season, and it is arguably what got him to the final. I'm not sure he would have made it to the final otherwise. He finds the shield in the challenge. Charlotte is then banished, and that evening, instead of murdering, they recruit Ross. And they wake up the next day. The argument is, well, it can't be Harry because they tried to murder him and no one's been murdered. It can't be Zach, Jazz, Andrew, or Molly because they knew about the shield. So it has to be Evie, Ross, or Jasmine. Ross is the first on the pedestal because he batted so hard for Paul, and someone even said it in that round table that they thought that Ross was a recruited traitor. They were wrong at that point, but Ross was a recruited traitor at this point, and he goes the same episode, and it's so like bitter sweet because he had said he was going to avenge his mum and then goes that episode, but he got very defensive, kind of like Anthony. You know, he said to Andrew about something Andrew had said, Andrew lied, and he just kind of got very defensive, and I think that was the end for him. I think he kind of lost his cool a little bit. It's a tough one because he's kind of screwed over, but I think his plea or his goal to avenge his mum, to me, it wasn't something that was going to come to fruition, and I didn't want it to because he wanted to get Harry out, and I was like, Harry deserves to win at this point. They then murder Zach. The next episode makes sense. I think at this point, they hadn't murdered Jazz, so I would have murdered Jazz over Zach at this point because I think Zach was more on Harry's side. But I guess Harry didn't know that Jazz was a little bit suspicious of him. And then from here, that is the last murder. And this is obviously from the last few episodes. So if you haven't watched the last few episodes, definitely don't continue listening. But they they banish Jasmine, which makes sense because of the theory around the shield. And then they banish Evie again because of the theory around the shield. Evie kind of rolled over and let it happen though, which was disappointing. Also, she came out as a lesbian in the last episode, she didn't, but she kind of revealed that she was a lesbian to the audience, I guess, for the first time for us, and I kind of was a bit taken back. I was like, oh, love that for us. Love that we've got some representation on the show when I didn't kind of realize that we did. And that kind of shield theory ends there, but that is just such a good play. Ross, then they murder Zach, Jasmine and Evie, one in a row. And obviously Ross was a traitor, so it looked like the theory had legs. It was a really well done play, and I think Harry didn't realize what he had done until it was happening, and it definitely got him to the final because I think it would have been raised that he had gotten so many traitors and never kind of been put on questioning. But then we move into the final four, and it makes sense at this point that you would get rid of someone. They think there's one more traitor because they've gotten Ash, they got Miles, and they got Paul, and they know that there was at least one more there was one recruitment, but they potentially have the theory out there that there was 4 to start with, which they were right about. So they know that there's probably at least one more traitor, and Andrew has enough sus on him that they can kind of conclude that it was him, and it makes the most sense. Poor Andrew, like I think he didn't really know how to play the game, and he was kind of just bumbling around, and he was a faithful and a good faithful. I think he would have probably made it to the end as a faithful. But once he got recruited, I think he just couldn't handle it. He didn't know how to play it. And so he obviously goes out 4th, but he tells about his story, about his car crash and his scars. And I think it's awful to hear what he went through, but to hear the players' stories about what they've gone through, it's a nice moment to have. Interestingly, a lot of the people on the show, at least towards the end, and they even talk about it, have had crazy things happen to them. And it's a really nice dinner table moment where they kind of open up to each other about the things that they've been through, with Andrew and his kind of his injuries, and Jazz and his family, and Molly and her kind of her health, and Harry with his poorer upbringing, I think he alludes to, with lots of brothers and sisters, and also like going into the army. He talks about how it's tough, and it's a nice moment. And I do like when reality competition shows take a moment towards the end to pause and kind of allow the players to connect, and especially with the audience connect, because this stuff we haven't heard about really up until this point, especially not in detail. But we then obviously head into the final 3, and at this point, Jazz decides to make his suspicions known about Harry, which, in my opinion, it's too late. You haven't sowed the seeds. There's no way Molly's going to feel comfortable turning on Harry, because at this point, she thinks that all 3 of them are faithful. And so she thinks that Jazz is just making a mistake, and that he's wrong, because she's not had this theory in her head at all from Jazz. And so the question for her isn't necessarily, is Harry a traitor? It's actually a question of, who do I want to win with? Who do I want to split the money with? And she has a closer connection with Harry, so it makes the most sense. Obviously, she slightly listens to his suspicions and writes his name and then changes it, which obviously heartbreaking because she then finds out. But I think it makes the most sense for her sticking to her gut and sticking to her guns, which is that she's connected the most with Harry. She doesn't think that he's a traitor. And if it turned out that he wasn't, and she just voted him out, I think that would have been harder to deal with. But who knows? It's all hypotheticals. Anyway, Molly then finds out that Harry is a traitor. And what a tough moment to watch. She kind of storms out, and that's it. You don't really hear from her unless you watched Uncloaked, which I did, and obviously they're still good and they're good friends, and it's nice to see. But on the actual show, she just kind of storms out, and that's the last you see. And then Harry wins the money. Very like shocked. He's kind of like, Claudia, in shock, like, oh, I've just won money, but my good friend has just stormed out on me. But he played a really, really good game. People all say it as they're getting voted out. Like, he played a really, really good game. He was what Wilf from season 1 kind of wanted to be, but he was sweet. He was smart. He got a little bit cocky at times, but it never really came into his gameplay. And I think that's why he made it to the end, because he was never acting in a way that felt calculated to people. Whereas I think Wilf towards the end, when Kieran left the parting gift, I think it put thoughts in the finalists' heads, and they started looking back at his behaviour, and because he'd been shifty, they voted him out, and the faithfuls won the money. And I'm glad that this season there was a different outcome than last season. I think it would have been a bit like, oh, the faithfuls won again. And then we would have felt like going into season 3 that the faithfuls are just going to win again because it's really difficult to win as a traitor. But I actually think it's probably easier to win as a traitor. But Harry wins all the money to himself instead of splitting it between 3 people like they did last season. And I think he definitely deserved it. From about the Paul banish when he made that monologue in the round table, from about that point is when I felt he just deserved to win it regardless. I kind of felt it was what was right, was for him to win. My final thoughts on the season as a whole are that it was really great. I think airing it in January is a really good time to air it because I think everyone's kind of come back holidays, everyone's going into the office and it's all a bit drab. And to have this, like, the office was always talking about the traitors. Work was always talking about the traitors. My friends, my family. It was just this thing you couldn't escape from, which was so much fun to be a part of. They knew what they were going for this season a lot more. I think it found its feet really, really well. And the challenges were really good. The cast was really good. There were some really great players and also some spectacularly bad ones, which is what you want. You don't want everyone to be really good at the game. You want there to be a big diversity in skill, and there was. You can start to see it in the first few episodes, the people that are making the mistakes. Like, I could see in the first few episodes, Miles was making mistakes. He wasn't saying names. He was being very fade into the background. And had he gotten any further, he would have just been banished at the final 4 or 5 because there's nothing for them to trust about him because they've never heard him say a name. But overall, I really enjoyed the season. I think 5 out of 5 stars, probably maybe 4.5 out of 5. And can't wait until the next season. As a sober person watching it, it's really great television. The only thing I'm thinking is I will be safe from the Poisoned Chalice because I'm not drinking fizzy wine. But it's really great to see people talk about their stories. I mean, Molly as kind of a representation for people with stomas, but also people with disabilities. It's refreshing to see on the BBC just people playing the game. It's not this big moment or it's not this big call out to her. She gets to talk about her story, but it's not who she is. And even bigger than that, people like Jazz talking about his difficulties and Andrew. I think it's what we want from reality TV. We don't want to see people who are robots or people who don't represent the everyday person. And when I say everyday person, I mean everyday everyone. So it's a wonderful show beyond just the cutthroat drama, where it is just such good television. It's so well made. I can't wait for next season. This has been Saying Something Sober, keeping me sober 222 days as of recording episode 5.